Welcome back to Through the Bible Women's Bible Study. We haven't talked about Sarai in a while, so we're going to get back to including her in the story in Genesis chapter 16. Verses 1 through 2 say, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. They are tired of waiting for God's promise. So they take matters into their own hands to help God. They have a human solution for a God-sized problem. It's always trouble when we try to help God. God's promise wasn't to any son of Adam, Abram, but to Abram's special descendant, which will come through Sarai, and it will lead to the Messiah. Now, Hagar was probably part of the loot that Abram was given when he was in Egypt and he and Sarai got kicked out and the Pharaoh sent gifts. Well, she was probably part of that. This is another thing that shows a consequence of Abram not staying in the promised land and trusting God and going to Egypt during the drought. If he hadn't gone, there would have been no Hagar in the picture. Now, Hagar wasn't a slave, but more of a female servant. It pretty much just means she had a better life than a slave. Now, Sarai, you think, how could she do this? But she's in pain. Her prayers haven't been answered. Her arms haven't held her own baby. And there's public shame. They'd been back for 10 years and still no baby. Now, polygamy was a way to make sure there was an heir, but it was never God's plan. Now, rich women, they preferred an ancient version of a surrogate mother. It was pretty common in their world. According to custom, the child would be considered the child of Abram and Sarai, not Abram and Hagar. She might be thinking that, well, God, you keep promising Abram he'll be the father of many nations, but you haven't promised that I'd be the mother. Maybe he's the father, but someone else is the mother. There's so much sin in this thought. There's a lack of faith. She's encouraging defilement at the marriage between one man and one woman and the marriage bed. And Abram agreed. But why wouldn't he? He's an 85-year-old being told by his 75-year-old wife to have sex with a younger woman. This is the second time that a husband got into major trouble by following his wife's instruction. Remember Adam? He did as Eve asked. Notice Job. He didn't follow his wife's advice. Anytime we try to fulfill God's promises in our own way and our own methods, we get nowhere. And we might even prolong the time until the promise is fulfilled because everything's got to be fixed to get back to where it needs to be. Other examples, Jacob had to live in exile for 25 years because he thought he had to fulfill God's promise to get his father's blessing. Moses had to tend sheep for 40 years in the desert after he tried to fulfill God's promise by murdering an Egyptian. God doesn't need our help. Verses 3 and 4. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So Abram does the deed, and Hagar gets pregnant, which must have made Sarai feel so inadequate, because that shows, at least in her mind, that it's her that's the problem, not her husband. And isn't it kind of ironic? In Egypt, Abram had given his wife up to Pharaoh. Here, Sarah is giving her husband up to an Egyptian. Now, Hagar probably wasn't a wife as much as a concubine. A concubine is a secondary kind of wife without the full rights of a wife. Still, not in God's plan. Abraham's son, Isaac, he will stay monogamous, but his grandson Jacob is going to have 4 wives. God's plan was always one man, one woman. So when it says that Hagar had contempt or despised Sarai, the Hebrew means to be light, to be swift, to be insignificant. In Hebrew, to have weight means to have honor, to give weight to something, rather than to treat something lightly. In a culture that childbearing was so honored and valued, mothering a child of a wealthy and influential man like Abram, that gave Hagar a big rise in her status, and it made her appear more blessed than Sarai. She begins to think she's better and greater than Sarai. So this bad situation is just getting worse. Verses 5 and 6. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So Sarai's blaming this whole thing on Abram. Now, whose idea was it? But Abram should have been the spiritual leader and told her, no, we need to trust God for his promise. Sarai tattles on Hagar about her contempt. But Abram doesn't treat it appropriately. He makes the matter worse by turning the situation over to Sarai, who's not thinking straight anywhere way, and he's not taking care of his child or the mother of his child. The one good thing was he did put Sarai first, but not in a good way. Now we look at it and say, that's just cruel. But in their culture, they had documents on how to deal with concubines. They could be sold, but they could never be sold, but they could be relegated to the status of a slave and branded. There's an ancient law book called The Laws of Umami, and it said a concubine could have her mouth scoured out with 1 quart of salt. As the first wife, Sarah had the power. She could have done that. No one could have said anything. Now, where else have we seen someone who isn't accepting their responsibility in a wrongdoing? Adam Adam tried to pass on the responsibility and make excuses. Now, it's possible that Sarai had Hagar removed as a concubine and returned to service. Sarai's cruelty collided with Hagar's pride, and all Hagar could think of was run, get out of here. It kind of was predestined because Hagar means to flee. So a slave running away was a serious legal matter and with serious consequences. She was probably heading back to Egypt, her original home. In fact, we're going to see some verses that really indicate that. Verses 7 through 9 says, "The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?' She said, 'I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.'" So Hagar sees this body of water, a spring, and she decides she needs to stop right there. She's probably reluctant to leave it because water is the lifeblood of the desert. She's in a bad place mentally. And that's when the angel of the Lord came to her. He found her. And like the good shepherd who leaves the 99 to search for the lost sheep, the angel of the Lord hunts down this girl who's running away from the family of faith. This is the first reference in the Bible to an angel, and in particular to the angel of the Lord. This angel didn't show up to Noah, to Enoch, to Abram. He shows up to a single mother-to-be who had a pride problem and was mistreated by the woman who put her in the situation in the first place. And she is outside the family of God's chosen people. God chooses whom he's going to work through. Now, it seems like this angel has a physical presence because he has a conversation with Hagar. Later, we're going to see that Hagar believed this person was God himself. Now, when God himself shows up physically, we believe it's really the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, the second person in the Trinity. John 1:18 says, "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." And 1 Timothy 6:16 says, "No one has ever seen God in the person of the Father." Ever. So this is not God the Father. But most believe it is God the Son. So we're going to see this same angel of the Lord in Genesis. Well, we saw in Exodus 3 appearing to Moses, Numbers 22 appearing to Balaam, Judges 2 appearing to Israel, Judges 6 appearing to Gideon, Judges 13 appearing to Samson's parents, 2 Samuel 24 appearing to David, and 1 Kings 19 appearing to Elijah. So in the same way that this angel of the Lord first appeared to a single mother-to-be, the first time the resurrected Jesus appeared, he honored a woman, Mary Magdalene, by appearing to her first. So notice how this angel addresses Hagar, servant of Sarai, not wife of Abraham. Running away didn't change her relationship nor her responsibility. She was still Sarai's maid with the responsibility to serve her. So the angel asked two important questions. Does he know the answer to them? Of course, he asked, where have you come from and where are you going? She had probably just run without a thought. He is asking so that she can stop and focus. Hagar thought she knew. I came from the most terrible place ever and I'm going nowhere. The angel of the Lord said, I have a plan for you. Let's do this. The angel of the Lord told her to repent. Repent means turn around and change direction. But with this, there was a promise. He isn't telling her to go back to an abusive household without a promise of protection. He says, obey me and I will protect you. Verse 10 through 12 says, the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So there's a promise here that her son would be the father of innumerable descendants. He's promising it. That's another clue that he's not just a normal angel, because it is him. I will surely multiply. Angels can't multiply that. And Ishmael does become the ancestor of multitudes. He's the ancestor of the Arab people, while his half-brother Isaac will become the ancestor of the Jewish people. This kind of puts a tragic spin on the Arab-Jewish conflicts. They share a common father, Abraham, and both groups honor Abraham. Now Ishmael, something interesting, he's the first person in the Bible to get a name before he was born. That shows God has a plan for this kid and for his descendants. So the angel prophesies that Ishmael and his descendants, they're going to be troublemakers. The stuff about a wild man, the Arabs are notoriously violent. Now, not every Arab is, but there is a lot of violence in the Arab community. They seem to kill each other more than they kill Jews or Christians. And again, that is not every Jew, every Arab. But there are sects of Arabs that their life goal is to kill the Jews. Now your version, where mine said, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen, yours might say, will live to the east. Living to the east in the Bible is typically not a good thing. There's lots of examples. One is Adam and Eve. They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden to the east. Every time something is moved to the east, that's not a good thing. Now, there's a lot of Christians that think God's plan is to wipe out all the Arabs because of their hatred of the Jews and the persecution of Christians. You won't find that in the Bible. If God didn't want the Arabs to survive, it would have been easy to take care of it right here and now. He could have allowed Hagar and this unborn child to die in the wilderness, but he didn't. He intervened. He could have allowed Hagar to live, but just disappear with the baby. Seems like she was heading toward Egypt. Nope, didn't allow that. God specifically commanded Hagar to go back, to stay in the story. Ishmael means God will hear. Hagar is getting a promise that God will hear. God will not ignore this child. His life won't be easy, but God will be watching and protecting him. There's a comparison between the angel's words to Hagar and the initial promise that Abram received in chapter 12. They both receive a command, but they're very different. Abram, the command is to leave his father's house, while Hagar is return to her mistress. Both include the promise that they will become great through their descendants. Both include a description of the relationship of their descendants to others. Abram's seed are there to be a blessing to all nations, but Hagar's, they're going to be a source of universal contention and strife. Verse 13 through 15. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer-lahai-roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So this is where we see Hagar called the angel God, the God who sees. Now this is the only time in the Bible where a human gives God a name. She knows that if God is with her in the wilderness, he will be with her when she goes back to Sarai. So she goes back with a submissive heart. She must have told Abram what happened because Abram names the child Ishmael, just as the angel instructed. We even have a clearer and more wonderful promise of this than Hagar ever had. We have the promise of Jesus in Matthew 28:20. Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. David Guzik says, if you have to submit in difficult circumstances, God sees. If you ache under the pain of ministry, God sees. If you just feel like running, God sees. God has met you, sent Jesus near, and gives you new hope. Ligon Duncan says, but I want you to see that after all these machinations, after all these attempts on the part of Abram and Sarai and Hagar to work out the situation, that with regard to the fulfillment of the promises of the covenant, Abram is right back where he started from. He has not taken one step forward towards the fulfillment of God's promises towards him since the beginning of the chapter. Many troubles, many sorrows, but not one step forward in the progress of redemption, because God is going to do things his way. That is the end of chapter 16. Thank you as always for joining. Hope you enjoy this. Click like. Think about subscribing. I'd enjoy seeing you on a regular basis. And again, thank you for joining.